we're watching the concept of free speech and press freedom being reshaped and distorted before our eyes, against a backdrop of a information war that is one component of the hybrid war that the U.S. is waging as against what it calls its near peer competitors, Russia and China. And I think we've seen throughout the past week, this for several weeks, an escalating attack on alternative media and on counter hegemonic media from states that are designated enemies. And, I think this is all, we have to see it all as one part. We have to see the attack on Assange and WikiLeaks as part of the US government's effort to limit the public's access to inconvenient facts. It's what I would call free speech with American characteristics, where information is limited. The information flow is limited by the US government, but the US public is unable to see the censor's hand. It's I would say, a more crude repackaging or iteration of the Ed Herman model of propaganda, of manufacturing consent. It's actually enforcing consent. And Julian Assange, why is he in the glass box? Why has he been in solitary confinement during COVID, during a pandemic? Why is he in a maximum security prison instead of being under house arrest? Why was he confined for years in an embassy for jumping bail? Why has he been so roundly demonized by the stenographers of power? It is to make an example of him in medieval fashion, as Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, as so many figures who led rebellions were publicly tortured. This is what's going on here. And the point of it all is to just say, you could be next. And I think for many opportunists and careerists, they've shut up. They understand the message. They're taking it. And the question is, who's going to take that risk? Who's going to run up against this constantly shifting government red line on speech and take that risk to do real national security reporting, which could include publishing classified information or publishing information about covert U.S. activity to tell the public? Because as Julian Assange said, every war is the product of lies. And the best mechanism to stop war is to simply tell the public the truth.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, joined by my co-host Max Blumenthal, and today we're talking about one of the most important court cases going on right now in the entire world. I'm talking about Julian Assange, the political prisoner and imprisoned journalist in the high-tech terror security prison, Belmarsh Prison, which is for so-called terror suspects. He's held 23 and a half hours per day. He was held in solitary for a while, and for the supposed crime of publishing factual information in the public interest and exposing U.S. war crimes. So we're talking about the kangaroo court hearings that are going on, and we're talking with one of the only journalists, at least independent journalists, who's covering this case very closely. I'm talking about Kevin Gosztola. And Kevin Gosztola is the managing editor of Shadowproof, which is a great website. You should check that out. It's shadowproof.com. And then he's also a co-host of the weekly podcast Unauthorized Disclosure, which is co-hosted by a friend of ours, Rania Khalek. So you should definitely check out his podcast. So let's just jump in, Kevin. Can you talk about the latest in what is really, for me, it's kind of dystopian, because it's already bad enough that Julian Assange, a journalist, is being held in this high-tech maximum security prison that, again, I mentioned is supposedly for terror suspects. But even aside from that, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. There are many reports that he has not been given adequate medical attention. There's even concerns that he might actually have contracted COVID-19. So then there's that element. Then there's the element that more than 60 doctors signed an open letter in Lancet, the leading medical journal, saying that he's not getting adequate medical attention. Then there's the fact that the current United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, has said that Julian Assange is being tortured, or he has shown symptoms of psychological torture. And then finally, there's the element of this weird digital stream that they're doing, and only a small number of journalists have access to the court proceedings that are going on because you're watching it online from the US. So, I mean, every level of this is really just kind of Orwellian and dystopian, but maybe can you just give us an overall bird's eye view of what's going on right now?
Well, I think if you want to get into Orwellian, I had this vision in my head because we thought that one of the members of the prosecution team may have come into contact with the virus and gotten COVID, and it actually disrupted the proceedings, and they were halted on Thursday. And so I had this vision that perhaps what the judge was going to do, because she doesn't want to adjourn the proceedings, is she was just going to haul Julian Assange into this glass box at the back of the courtroom every day, while all of us and the defense attorneys and the prosecutors now pile onto this video platform, and you just have Julian Assange looking at all these screens with a judge just leering over him in the other end of the courtroom. And to me, I just think that would be like quite the image for what this case is so far, because there has been systematic denial of his due process rights all along. We started these proceedings on September 7th with his attorney, Edward Fitzgerald, informing the court that it had been about 6 months since he was able to meet in person with Julian Assange, and he had met in person with him that morning for the first time. And so all along, there have been examples to say that he hasn't been protected at all. You can go back to the February hearing when he was complaining that he couldn't follow along with what was being said in that 1 week hearing where they were arguing over the law and arguing over whether the extradition treaty gave the U.S. authority to seek his extradition. And he couldn't hear. We constantly were stopping and starting the proceedings. Then he made a request to the judge to sit with his attorneys, which was not opposed by the lead prosecutor, who is representing the U.S. government. And yet the judge insisted that he remain in the glass box at the back of the courtroom. And so, and we also have the example of him making a request to be released on bail because of the pandemic and its threat to the Belmarsh security prison, and saying, you can put me on home confinement. I'll go in this house wherever I am going to be living temporarily. I'll put an electronic tag on me. And she insisted that, again, showing this contempt for the institution of asylum that we've seen in the UK and in the United States. And then you could throw in Sweden and then, of course, Ecuador, suggesting that somehow going to an embassy and claiming asylum represents you fleeing from accountability.
Right. And first of all, happy 9/11, guys. This is 9/11. It's the day that everything changed. According to Paul Krugman, Muslims were treated very well. Things were handled pretty well while he was on vacation in the Virgin Islands. He wasn't stopped. So, the Pentagon is lit up on the 19th anniversary, and 9/11 triggered a series of events that did actually change things for the worse, and we're still living with the consequences. I think if WikiLeaks had existed around that time, the war in Iraq would have been much harder to wage. It certainly would have been much harder for the Bush administration to deploy a series of deceptions and convince the public that Iraq had WMDs and that there was a secret relationship between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, which the U.S. later went on to support after helping to germinate it during the Afghan proxy war. all of these secrets, these state secrets, I think could have come out and appeared if the internet had been more developed and if a mechanism like WikiLeaks with a kind of secure drop or some sort of mechanism for whistleblowers to come forward was available. And when it did become available, I think we need to just be really elemental here in this discussion before we get into the details of the case. If it had been developed, when it was developed, it humiliated and embarrassed the Hillary Clinton State Department, the CIA, the Defense Department, Stratcom, which was the sort of known as the private CIA, this private, basically private spying firm, and so many other national security state interests by simply showing how they were lying to the public and deceiving populations across the world, as well as, paying opposition movements and so many other things we've revealed at the Gray Zone. This is why Julian Assange is in a glass box in court. This is why he's in Belmarsh National Security Prison. This is why he was falsely accused of rape. This is why his reputation has been savaged in the media, along with the DNC leaks and the Podesta leaks, which really turned the kind of liberal press against him. So it's really important to just say that up front. And Kevin, you've been reporting on some dramatic developments here. It's important first, before we even discuss those, to just remind our viewers and listeners that this is an extradition hearing, and the government that is seeking to extradite Julian Assange, the United States government, is not his government. He is not a citizen of the United States. He's a citizen of Australia, which has basically been de facto annexed by the United States, is not standing up for him, has betrayed his family. He's not a citizen of the UK where he's being held. He spent very little time in the United States, as far as I know. He has no familial connection to the United States. So this part of it seems extremely unprecedented. And I want to talk about your report on how Trump's war on journalism has taken center stage at the extradition hearing. But before we get into that, why is a country that Julian Assange is not a citizen of, why is that government seeking to extradite him in your view?
Well, in my view, it's very clear that the United States government wants to extradite Julian Assange because he exposed United States torture and war crimes. I mean, it's really appropriate to talk about this on the anniversary of 9/11 because all of the crimes that were committed in the aftermath of those attacks were in some way exposed by WikiLeaks. I mean, there was so much information that Chelsea Manning provided to WikiLeaks in these disclosures that form the basis of the alleged crimes that the United States is trying to argue were committed. And in fact, they aren't crimes. But we heard evidence in this last week, in this first week of the extradition hearing, involving the way in which WikiLeaks exposed renditions to CIA black site prisons. We've heard evidence in the past week, particularly from Clive Stafford Smith, who's a human rights attorney, who was the legal director at Reprieve, who has represented Guantanamo Bay prisoners. He went into some detail about how WikiLeaks cables that they published exposed what was happening with the Pakistan government in coordination with the CIA to conduct drone strikes in Pakistan. And those materials played a part in convincing a high court in Pakistan that the U.S. was committing war crimes against the population. And they entered an official finding. And then he said, you saw that the drone strikes led up and there were less killing that was happening because of that decision. And so I think that the United States is upset with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks because of the scrutiny that was brought to their actions and the efforts that they emboldened to hold the U.S. accountable. I mean, of course, they exposed how the U.S. was conspiring behind the scenes with German prosecutors and Spanish prosecutors to thwart any sort of investigation of President George W. Bush and his administration and the way that they were authorizing and pursuing torture and the way that they were conducting these renditions. Of course, Baltazar Garzón is a prosecutor, or is a lawyer who was involved in seeking accountability, and he is now part of Assange's legal team. So it comes full circle. In saying that, I believe, if he wasn't someone who was focused on this particular information, if he had played the role of good reporter, then he would never have been targeted. And I use that deliberately because Max Frankel, an affidavit that he submitted in the Pentagon Papers case, came up in these proceedings in the past week. And he was someone who was involved in convincing the court that the Pentagon Papers, when they were published, was not criminal. And so I just believe that if Julian Assange had been a good reporter, like a lot of people are in the U.S. media establishment, where they don't challenge what the United States is doing, then maybe he wouldn't be in the Belmarsh prison right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's my view as well. And he would be working for the Washington Post or the New York Times. I have images in my hard drive of the cell phone of Ellen Nakashima and the cell phone of Anthony Lowell Bergman. The first reporter is the Washington Post lead national security reporter. The second one is a New York Times national security reporter. Those cell phones were opened, photographed, they were hacked into, and information was exfiltrated from them by UC Global, which is the Spanish security firm, which was it very clearly appears to have been a CIA contractor contracted under the watch of Mike Pompeo to run this black operations campaign as they were handling security at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where Julian Assange was taking sanctuary and seeking asylum somewhere. And you would think that these reporters having their phones hacked by an intelligence service simply for meeting with a source or someone they were reporting about would freak out, and that this would be a titanic scandal, and that the New York Times and Washington Post editorial boards would issue thundering editorials demanding accountability at the top and calling for hearings on what the CIA is doing to attack journalism. But neither reporter has said a word. Go look at the Twitter feed of Ellen Nakashima. It's like her rattling off one official unnamed U.S. source, according to official U.S. source this, according to U.S. official that, one story after another, just relying on the U.S. intelligence apparatus and national security state as a source. It shows, I think, very clearly why she hasn't said a word about this, is because she doesn't want to interrupt her very close and intimate relationship with the CIA and the national security state or the Washington Post.
Yeah, and on the note of these mainstream U.S. journalists just totally going against a fellow journalist, Julian Assange, and Kevin's point about Julian Assange being punished for not being on message, I actually wrote an article at the Gray Zone in which I was looking at what the Washington Post was saying about Assange just a year ago. And they have a neoconservative columnist, Mark Thiessen, who is a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush. And he wrote an article in which he insisted that Assange is not a journalist because, and this is an exact quote that he wrote in the Washington Post, because unlike, quote, reputable news organizations, Assange did not give the U.S. government an opportunity to review the classified information WikiLeaks was planning to release so they could raise national security objections. And then he added, responsible journalists have nothing to fear. So, by the way, Mark Thiessen, this Washington Post columnist, he also tweeted, Julian Assange is no hero. He is the devil. Talk about nuance there. But, I mean, he tweeted that insane opinion. But the other thing I just quoted from, that's a direct quote from a column he wrote in the Washington Post insisting that Julian Assange is not a journalist because they didn't allow the U.S. government to review what they were leaking and allow the U.S. government to redact information that challenged so-called national security. I mean, that just spells it all out right there.
And it's very clear to me that if Vladimir Putin and the FSB had done this or stood accused of doing this to US journalists, this would be an international scandal. So I think right there, you can see the hypocrisy of the US press on Julian Assange and their, I wouldn't say silence, but sort of muted coverage of this landmark case. First of all, I mean, what do you think the implications are of this trial for press freedom? Because this has been a central theme of this round of hearings. And can you talk about the testimony of Trevor Timm, the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, who took the stand on behalf of the defense to address this issue, specifically of press freedom, and really appears to have kicked the ass of the prosecution?
Yeah, so press freedom, obviously, the defense has made this a focus of these proceedings, just so people are clear, because there's been some confusion about how extradition proceedings work. I just want to make sure that your listeners understand that the prosecutors are under no obligation to prove their case against Julian Assange in this setting. It is all on the defense to convince this judge, and it seems rather futile, although they're going to do it anyway because they've got to prepare for an appeal and so on and so forth. But we know from Matt Kennard of Declassified UK that Judge Vanessa Baretzer has a record of approving 96% of extradition cases. And so she's pretty much a rubber stamp. She's a kind of yes woman careerist in the UK court system. It's believed that she's just looking for the next position she could get in a higher court in the UK. And so, they made it a part of this first week of focusing on the press freedom elements. And they brought Trevor Timm in, who is the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And I think he's a really important person to put on the stand, to go beyond just having a professor who can share good words about their expertise and their scholarship on freedom of the press, because he's actually been doing work to, whether they deserve it or not, because I don't know if they're going to use it, he's been helping the mainstream media organizations outfit their outlets with SecureDrop, with these submission systems, so they can, if they had any inclination, act like WikiLeaks and accept whistleblower documents and accept submissions from anonymous sources and potentially do so in the identity of those people. And so he took the stand and he described, how WikiLeaks is not this organization that should be stigmatized. It's not this organization that has engaged in something other than journalism. It has done what journalists have done for at least the last half century, if not longer, in collecting documents, in soliciting leaks from journalists. And so he sat on the stand and he took on this lead prosecutor named James Lewis, who had truly bullied previous witnesses before Trevor Timm took the stand. There was one peace studies professor named Paul Rogers who got pushed around a little bit. But Mark Feldstein, the author of Poisoning the Press, really got beat around and made to submit to what the prosecutor's line of questioning was. But Trevor Timm's really smart about this. I know him. I met him way back in 2011 when he was coming through law school. He worked under James Goodall, who was the general counsel for the New York Times, who's been possibly one of the strongest voices in the legal profession, challenging the Obama administration. And he was one of the few that even called out the grand jury investigation into WikiLeaks during the Obama years. And so Trevor knows his stuff. And he sat on the stand and was taking these questions from James Lewis about why should we listen to what you have to say? Why should we trust your opinion? And he made it clear that the Supreme Court is actually in line with his own views that this is journalism that WikiLeaks engaged in. He, put it in the context of the larger war on journalism that we have seen from Donald Trump, where he views many journalists, including those that we find obnoxious, to be enemies of the people. He sat there and he also had the wherewithal to not fall for what the prosecutor was trying to set him up to agree with, because he came at him and said, look, I disagree with this line of argument, but this is what they're trying to say, him as the prosecutor. He's claiming that WikiLeaks is only being charged, or Julian Assange is only being charged with publishing documents that revealed informants' names. That's totally bogus because there are general conspiracy charges within the indictment that target him for all of the materials that were published. But they have singled out documents that they say exposed U.S. military informants or people who were human intelligence sources that were working with the U.S. State Department. And so he said, do you think it was wrong, irresponsible for WikiLeaks to publish this material? And Trevor said, well, it doesn't really matter what I think. It doesn't matter what my editorial judgment would have been in that case, because the question here is, was there a crime that was committed or not? And the fact is, in the United States, you are not alleging a crime. It doesn't exist. In fact, he raised the example of what happened after the WikiLeaks publications. Senator Joe Lieberman tried to push a SHIELD law, a SHIELD Act law that would have made it a crime for any journalist to publish any material that contained informants' names. And it didn't pass in Congress. So it's not a law. And what they're trying to go after Julian Assange for is not a crime in the United States.
Right. There is no precedent at all, but beyond that, and I'm not going to be able to call up the name, but as far as I know, a member of the Pentagon brass testified before the Senate that WikiLeaks did not put any U.S. service members in danger or contribute to the deaths of any service members.
Yeah. I remember that because I covered that court-martial, and he sat there and he was asked to recall if anyone, in these war zones, I think it was actually Afghanistan in particular, had anybody actually been killed. And it was interesting because at one point he said that someone had died, and then they went back and the defense attorney, David Coombs, who represented Chelsea Manning, challenged it and forced the judge to make the witness who you're referring to change his answer, because it was actually someone who I believe was with a Taliban affiliated group that killed that person, and they had already had the information. They didn't need to get it from WikiLeaks. So there's all of this very convenient reworking of history that goes on in the record that the U.S. is manipulating in order to connect it to WikiLeaks, when in fact that's not really what happened.
Right. And meanwhile, the Iranian IRGC broke an entire network of CIA spies inside Iran using Google. So it's just that they've created this mystique around WikiLeaks, like the whole thing existed to provide the CIA's knock list of undercover confidential informants, when there's simply no evidence and it's been contradicted by the Pentagon.
I remember the most favorite argument that fell completely apart in Chelsea Manning's trial was that Osama bin Laden, the diplomatic cables, and that they were found on some hard drives or on his computer when they raided the Osama bin Laden compound, and that, he had asked an associate if he could get copies of the WikiLeaks documents. And so that means that WikiLeaks aided terrorists. And so Chelsea Manning aided terrorists. And I mean, it fundamentally criminalizes the entire concept of the internet, because we all have access to the same documents. And I mean, essentially this seems to me to be a continuation of that to some respect.
Yeah, I mean, there was also tons of pornography on Osama bin Laden's computer, so I'm guessing we're going to be held to the same standards. If you have, no, I mean, it's absolutely legally obscene and ridiculous. Everyone knows. Now, Kevin, I'm curious if you can talk more about what we've heard so far in the court proceedings, and particularly the mainstream media journalists who are covering it to the extent they are. They tried to make a big scandal out of this fact that Julian Assange interrupted the hearing. Can you respond to what happened there?
Yeah, it was called an outburst. And you saw this narrative take hold of the major media outlets that are covering this, the one of an unruly defendant with absolutely no empathy at all for what Julian Assange is going through. And I actually think Julian Assange was doing what I would have done if I was in that courtroom, because at that point, James Lewis was completely obnoxious. I think he was on the 7th or 8th time that he had asked the same question, and I can't remember what it was in particular, but at that point, he said, "This is nonsense." And to listen to the lines of questioning from the prosecutor in the last 3 days, I'll just give you a few absurd examples, and I'll come back to what we're talking about with this outburst, because this is why Julian Assange lost control. This prosecutor has referenced the federal rules of prosecution as if somehow that is evidence that the Justice Department is not plagued with political bias, as if that is somehow evidence that there's no political motive to bringing these charges against Julian Assange. And of course, and we were talking about Trevor Tim, and he was asked, about the federal rules of prosecution, and he says, well, I mean, the fact is that there's a Washington Post story where there are two people who I believe were prosecutors who say that they disagreed with charging Julian Assange, and a lot of it goes back to the institutional bias against charging Julian Assange because of First Amendment concerns that existed. And we might not be surprised because of the war on whistleblowers that took place with Barack Obama, but the Justice Department didn't see to it to indict Assange. And so Trump took it one step. So he's sitting there listening to these lines of questioning from James Lewis. That one other thing that they've been doing is treating the indictment like it is evidence, and any witness who is on the stand, if they disagree with what's in the indictment, then somehow they're biased and should not be taken seriously by the judge. It's rather infuriating. And so, Julian Assange lost control in his glass box that he's entrapped, and he said, "This is nonsense." There's another of the quote that I unfortunately don't have handy, or I can't rattle off the top of my head, but he said something about trying to follow this boxy. I think he was speaking to his powerlessness that he feels because he really doesn't think he can participate in his case. And at that moment, they actually stopped the proceedings. We came back. The judge scolded him and threatened to remove him from the rest of the extradition trial if he did this again. But his attorney got extra time for him to have to talk with him about this witness, because every time that a witness takes the stand, Julian Assange is sitting in the back of this courtroom, not able to consult with his attorneys on what's being said. So, if he thinks it's total nonsense what a witness is saying, and he wants his attorneys to steer the witness in a different direction, or if he wants them to challenge what the prosecution is saying in a certain way, he has no way of immediately communicating that to his legal team because he's trapped in the back of this courtroom.
We actually, I published at the Gray Zone a photograph which is unauthorized, not allowed by Judge Bareitzer during the last round of the extradition hearings, showing Julian in the glass box with Stella Morris, his partner, seated with his legal team several meters away from him, turning to attempt to communicate with him. And you can see the conditions he's being held in are actually much more restrictive and draconian than those in which Adolf Eichmann, who kept the Holocaust trains running on time for the Third Reich, was held in during his 1961 trial in Jerusalem. So there are so many war criminals and monsters who have been held in glass boxes or for propaganda reasons. Khodorkovsky, the Russian oligarch, was held in a kind of a cage. I think Mohamed Morsi was put in a glass box. He was the first elected president in Egyptian history in 5,000 years who was held in a cage or a glass box by the military junta of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. When he was put on trial, he died in prison. And in most cases, these figures are held in cages either because they are considered dangerous, which is really only a minority of cases, or because the prosecution and the government wants to portray to the rest of society that they are a monstrous threat to everyone's safety. And I think Julian's confinement is the most remarkable example of that, because this is someone who's not accused of doing anything violent. He's basically accused of publishing. So I think it's important to just look at that, and to look at that image. We'll put it on screen, or it's been on screen, I don't know, we'll do it in post, and look at the condition that he's in, just his physical condition. It's very clear that he has deteriorated physically in what amounted to solitary confinement for months and months and months in this maximum security prison, after living in this series of rooms, basically an annex within the tiny Ecuadorian embassy in London. And as I reported at the Gray Zone as well, during that time when he was at the Ecuadorian embassy, his legal team was spied on by UC Global, the apparent CIA contractor, through microphones implanted in the CCTV system, where a separate feed was set up to feed to the US, and through magnetic microphones planted on a fire extinguisher and even in the bathrooms there. Now, if a legal team is spied on, that means that their defense strategy has been exposed by the prosecution. The prosecution has gathered their strategy. What's more, Baltasar Garzón, who you mentioned, who's the lead of the defense team, the lead counsel for Julian Assange's defense team, who has a long history in universal and pioneering universal jurisprudence, is a famous Spanish judge. His office was broken into mysteriously. This was reported in Spanish media. And as I reported at the Gray Zone, UC Global's CEO and founder, David Morales, was actually proposing the idea of robbing or breaking into Garzón's office just weeks earlier. So put two and two together. It's not just spying on the defense team. It's apparently, it could be even rifling through the files in Garzón's office. Garzón has been spied on by UC Global. We know that as well. He's been followed to meetings, all associates of Assange. This, to me, should invalidate his extradition. But there's a separate development. You just tweeted about it. El País, the Spanish publication, I guess beat me to the story. It's hard editing so many people at once and then trying to get my own stuff out. But anyway, they scooped me on this. But you wrote, U.S. government officials are essentially demanding Spanish judge expose identities of whistleblowers who worked for private security company that targeted Assange with U.S.-backed espionage operation, which I just described. If judge doesn't reveal info, they will not cooperate. So I mentioned UC Global, the Spanish security contractor that was apparently working for the CIA, spying on Assange. There is a separate case in Madrid that's running parallel to this London case, where the head of that security contractor is on trial for violating client-attorney privilege, doing all of this illegal activity. And the U.S. Department of Justice is refusing to cooperate unless the protected witnesses in that case, who include his coworkers, are unmasked and exposed to even further harm. This seems to me completely crazy and unprecedented and illegal. And yet this is what the U.S. is doing in the open.
Yeah. We learned that there's someone named Michelle Wallach, the former head of operations at UC Global, who allegedly ordered these personnel to carry out the espionage operation against Assange, and that she's been called. I was not familiar with that individual. Her name had not surfaced in El País's reporting yet. And if it was in your reporting, I'm sorry I overlooked it.
It would have been if I could multiply myself by 4.
This witness too is the individual that comes up in the defense filings in this extradition case. And the idea that person would be outed if Assange wants justice, basically, what the U.S. is saying, if Assange wants justice in this case, you need to out these people. I mean, very clearly, they are not going to agree to that for the reasons that you're alluding to, because they would suffer retaliation from these rent-a-spooks that are facing these repercussions in Spain and in this court, where they actually do take seriously the issue of violations of privacy. And you were describing this operation that was carried out against Julian Assange. One thing I want to make sure people know is that after his arrest, all of the files or anything he had in his possession that was still in the Ecuador embassy was handed over to the U.S. government. It wasn't given back to Julian Assange. Kristen Harrison, the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief, made these statements outside of the embassy saying that they were trying to get his papers, his files. Apparently, Julian Assange was in the middle of writing a book. It was seized by the U.S. government. And there's another example of what they have that they're able to use that was confidential, that they're able to use to put together their case and also know what the defense is trying to do to try and beat the U.S. government as they bring these charges. And so, I mentioned James Goodall earlier on in this podcast interview because he's someone who said this espionage operation reminds him of how Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office was burglarized. And that essentially led to Daniel Ellsberg getting off and not being found guilty of violating the Espionage Act. It's the only reason why, and he will admit it himself, it's the only reason why he did not go to prison and he was not successfully convicted. And so, it seems that there's a ton of this kind of activity that should weigh against his extradition. It may be what in the end ends up saving him more than these arguments that we've talked about earlier, the press freedom stuff, the fact that WikiLeaks exposed war crimes and torture. I mean, ultimately, if you care at all, if you don't care about any of that, then as the judge, you should at least care. I mean, I'm not saying she will, but you should at least fall for the fact that they are violating attorney-client privilege. His doctor who met with him, I believe her name is Dr. Sandra Crosby. She was in the Ecuador embassy while this espionage operation out. She said she was taking confidential notes, and I believe she went to use the bathroom and came back and they were missing. And she found out that they were taken to a control room, and people who were in this room were working with these notes. And she put this down in her affidavit that was submitted in one stage or another of these proceedings. And so, not only have they been amateurish about this, but they just flagrantly steal private materials from Julian Assange and his doctors and his attorneys.
I mean, on the just continuing on the thread of flagrant theft, I was told by a participant in discussions inside the embassy on discussions of a plan to get Julian Assange asylum from a third party in cooperation with the then chief of SENAIN, the Ecuadorian intelligence chief, that when another participant from the meeting who was from the Ecuadorian government returned home on a chartered jet, he got out of the jet, left the airport in a official government vehicle. Two masked men on a motorcycle pulled up beside him with an assault rifle, pointed it in his face, and demanded his laptop, which was the laptop he had in the Ecuadorian embassy, which contained notes of the meeting and the plan and everything. After this took place, Todd Chapman, who was then the U.S. ambassador to Ecuador, began threatening Ecuadorian officials, do not do this. Do not do this. And I mean, they could have obtained the information about the plan through the surveillance inside the embassy. I'm not drawing a direct line between this alleged robbery and the threats by the U.S. ambassador. But he said, do not do this. And the Ecuadorian officials were freaked out. They said, how the hell does the U.S. know that this is taking place? Everything, we've been infiltrated. And the plan was abandoned and broken up because it required taking Assange out of the embassy at a time when, the police outside weren't expecting and having a car waiting. I mean, that's what I gathered about the plan. And so he would have been arrested. Beyond that, and I think this is something you can address, Kevin, there were plans put forward by David Morales, the CEO of UC Global, the alleged CIA contractor, which were obviously not carried out, to either poison Julian Assange or to kidnap him by leaving a door open at the embassy. And I think this is especially remarkable when this is just confirmed. It's on the record. These documents came out through the case in Spain, where Morales is on trial. It's remarkable in light of the freak out by the U.S., by the German government over the alleged poisoning of Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader. Here you have a journalist, a Western journalist, who apparently the CIA's contractor proposed poisoning, and you hear nothing about that in Western media. I mean, I wonder how this can figure into the case in the UK, how this can figure into the extradition case.
Well, to me, I haven't seen them make the connection yet, but what I heard from Mark Feldstein, who is the author of Poisoning the Press, was this book about Richard Nixon and his war against the press. It covered Jack Anderson, who was a syndicated columnist who very famously was targeted by intelligence operatives within the Nixon administration at the time. This came up and was raised by Mark Feldstein, and he talked about the different schemes that were developed by people linked to the Nixon administration to potentially assassinate Jack Anderson because he had obtained classified documents. They talked about things like smearing LSD on his steering wheel so that that might cause some kind of freak out, talking about ways that they could set him up to crash in his vehicle. And to me, I immediately, although the connection was not made in court, I wish the legal team had, but I immediately thought about what we've been hearing about UC Global and the schemes that have been acted to Julian Assange. And so, I think that to me, that's the parallel here is that this may not be the first time that the CIA has engaged in this kind of activity against a journalist in these ways that are on some degree cartoonish, but then also is very sinister, and how they show that they have no qualms with, there's no line that they will not cross in order to get Julian Assange, that they would be willing to commit a rendition even to bring Julian Assange to the United States for trial. And related to this operation, I think I'd like to make it clear that, I too remain baffled that the press, not even just in the United States, but globally hasn't made more out of what the CIA is alleged to have done here with this operation against a diplomatic embassy, which is supposed to be a protected building in any country. And I talked to Stefania Marizzi, who is this Italian journalist who was with La Repubblica and had visited Julian Assange. And she told me about what happened going in. And it's very clear to me that, not only do you have the espionage operation against Julian, but as you were talking about Ellen Nakashima earlier in this interview, but every journalist that went through there had to hand over their property to this security checkpoint that was basically masquerading as a security checkpoint. But what they were doing was taking your property when you came to visit Julian Assange, and they were rifling through it. And they'd go through your backpack, they'd go through your phones, and they give you no reason whatsoever for why you had to submit to this while you were visiting Julian Assange. And of course, they were obviously exploiting this idea that you need to keep this diplomatic building secure. And I don't know why journalists were agreeing to do this, but I guess part of it is it's the only way they're going to get to Julian Assange, that they have to do this in order to get past the checkpoint, in order to get to meet privately with him in the Ecuador embassy. And so they ultimately submitted, and Stefania had to submit to this kind of stuff. We haven't mentioned that that Glenn Greenwald had his Russian visas scanned, and
I can confirm that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen that.
Yeah.
And Pam Anderson, She had her email hacked into after writing down her password for Julian, and it was captured on the cameras. I mean, this is, you said you're baffled by the lack of interest, and I'll have a piece out this week about this. Why the press, or just with some details on why the press just showed so little interest. And when I say the press, I mean news organizations whose reporters were spied on, apparently by the CIA. What's even more baffling is that there's a clear link to the Trump organization here through Sheldon Adelson, Las Vegas Sands, one of the biggest Trump donors, who was basically doing a favor for Mike Pompeo and the Trump administration that he had contributed upwards of $100 million to through super PACs during the 2016 campaign. And in order for them to do his bidding on Israel, Palestine, and everything else. I mean, there are so many different elements working here. There's so many balls in the air, but there's a clear link to the Trump organization, and El País has started reporting. I've known a little bit about this, that UC Global was replaced with another firm to attack WikiLeaks that had much closer links to the Trump organization, something called Stars and Stripes or something like that. I think Times of London reported that. So, I mean, with all of the hatred in the air for Trump within the Beltway press, you would think that they would seize on this story. Mike Pompeo doing this speech, in his first speech as CIA director at CSIS, the think tank here in town, basically calling to invalidate the First Amendment in order to attack WikiLeaks because it's a hostile foreign intelligence organization. I mean, he openly laid it out, and yet nothing. I think they hate Julian Assange for what he did in 2016 and blame him for electing Trump. They hate him more than they hate Donald Trump, because they thought, he's sort of one of us. He's giving us all of this information. He's part of our world. And then he just crossed the red line. He's a turncoat. He's a traitor.
Yeah, well, there's an actual example that we should see Rachel Maddow on MSNBC repeating and hyperventilating over, but we haven't. There's this interlude that the defense brought up previously in the 1 week hearing back in February. I think you documented in your report or mentioned where Dana Rohrabacher and the right-wing activist Chuck Johnson met with Julian Assange. And apparently the defense believes they were sent to offer a pardon to Julian Assange if he was willing to provide evidence or to testify about what happened with the DNC leaks. Of course, Julian Assange decided that he didn't want to have anything to do with this and resisted the offer. But this preemptive pardon, as the defense team has described it, is there evidence that this case has been political? That, if Julian Assange had buddied up with Trump, that maybe he could have avoided being in this predicament. That to me seems like the kind of story that Rachel Maddow has routinely tried to fabricate on MSNBC, and yet we don't hear anything from her, anyone else on that network. We don't hear anything from the liberal establishment press about this because, as you say, they've turned against Julian Assange entirely. Of course, I just remember that Neera Tanden is and her insistence that it's not journalism to report on these emails that outed her and revealed how ridiculous she was in private, and how candid and how she acted with the Clinton campaign, that we're not supposed to pay attention to her. But the fact is that that we had in the Southern District of New York, I believe, when the DNC very stupidly brought a case against alleged Russian agents that were involved. I emphasize alleged very much, and WikiLeaks and the Trump administration, when they tried to say that they had done something against the DNC by publishing these Podesta emails and et cetera, that a judge there his name's John Kodal. He defended the First Amendment. He said that WikiLeaks had an unabashed right under the First Amendment to publish hacked materials, and that they didn't have to do anything to justify publishing that material. It was just allowed under the First Amendment. And that's something that these people on the progressive left, I think generally it's fair to put them in that bucket, or these centrist liberals have not been, which is that it is completely allowed for him to do that. And that said, the contents of these emails were extremely important to people understanding the war that the Democratic Party was fighting against a faction of people who had a lot of legitimacy to fight this establishment.
If using hacked material is off limits, then, so much for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, China leaks, so much for the Intercept's Iran leaks, and so much for what the CIA said they were doing with active duty CIA officers telling Yahoo News that we have become the US government's version of WikiLeaks. And most of what we do now is cultivate dissidents and engage in hack and dump operations where we're embarrassing Russia and China and other enemy states and dumping this information on journalistic outlets. And I believe, the two big projects that I just named, which are extremely dubious and unverified, could be the result of that. So, it really just depends on which side of the US government you fall on, the good side or the bad side. That's really what this case illustrates. And it also illustrates that, if you violate this secret code of Beltway journalistic culture, a mainstream journalistic culture, which is the same thing, you have to basically come out on the good side of the US government, the State Department, and the Democratic Party, or, you're a traitor. That's what this illustrates. Then all principles, the First Amendment, the Constitution, everything we believe in that is sacred to journalism goes out the door, and you're demonized as a libertarian, anarcho, rapist psychopath who just belongs in a glass box and can basically rot in hell. And let's see what happens.
Glass casket.
A glass casket. Let's see what happens if they bring him to the United States, how the press treats that. It would be remarkable. The case resumes on September 14th, and that's because one of the prosecutors, as you mentioned, said they had COVID. They thought, I don't even buy that, man. Like, they got their asses kicked in court, and then all of a sudden they're like, just say you had COVID, and because they needed to get their shit together. And all of a sudden of course they tested negative. I don't know how you can I was exposed to COVID. I guess they were around someone or something. But anyway, it seemed shady. So it resumes on September 14th, which is 3 days from now, which might be like, I don't know when this will be released, but maybe 2 days from now when it's released. But what is your sense of how things are going? I mean, we know the deck is stacked, that the judge approves 96% of extradition hearings. She's a circuit judge, completely unqualified, apparently. Her history has been disappeared from online. It looks like the deck is stacked, but
yeah, and if I can jump in for a second, also, yeah. Kevin, you mentioned a really good investigative team in the UK, Matt Kennard and Mark Curtis, who have been publishing really good, important work on Julian Assange, and they recently disclosed how the husband of this judge barrister, her husband is a major Conservative Party figure in the UK who served as Minister of Defense and also worked at the infamous neoconservative think tank, the Henry Jackson Society, which is closely linked to the UK government and linked to a lot of war and foreign policy decisions, extremely hawkish, and also even more disqualifying in terms of conflicts of interest. Her husband was involved in a complaint case against WikiLeaks. So, I mean, to me, that should be disqualifying. That's a very clear conflict of interest. But the only people talking about this are a very small team of independent journalists in the UK, it seems like.
Yeah, my sense is that there are some cards that the legal team might still be holding very close to the chest, and that they're not ready to play quite yet, because they do know that things are pretty stacked against them. We haven't talked about how this entire proceeding got started off, so I'll just quickly mention it because we saw in the last couple months that the U.S. government took this step of expanding the allegations against Julian Assange and totally blindsided the defense. And I know for a fact that they're not prepared because they have not been doing the research to dig into and rebut the misrepresentation of facts and the allegations that are being put forward against Assange as it relates to this new material that they're claiming, he's implicated in being involved in committing. They've tried to go after him now for criminal conspiracy and tie him to the LulzSec hacking that took place back. This is like 9 or 8 years ago. In fact, there were cases that moved through the UK court. So the defense very smartly asked the question of the judge, why is the U.S. government, if they're going to bring this, why didn't they indict Julian Assange back in 2011 or 2012 when any of this stuff was a big deal? And these general allegations now also include helping Edward Snowden leave Hong Kong and engaging in a kind of source protection that only they were willing to do. Of course, that's not something we saw from The Guardian. It's not something we saw from The Intercept. We saw WikiLeaks putting their lives on the line, sending Sarah Harrison there to help him get to a country. And then, of course, his passport was revoked and Snowden ended up trapped in an airport in Moscow. And so, and Sarah Harrison is an unnamed co-conspirator now, along with Jacob Appelbaum being a unnamed co-conspirator. And so this is something that is very a dramatic escalation in the way that this case is being pursued. And I think a cover for the fact that they believe that they may fail entirely with all the crimes that are alleged against Julian Assange in the publication of leaks from Chelsea Manning. And so now they're actually telling the court that they may not have to prove those crimes, that they may only need to prove general allegations around just conspiring to leak any kind of classified information from the U.S. government. It's very wildly absurd. And that they're just going to try to link Julian Assange to any kind of hacks that they can come up with, whether it's a bank in Iceland. And they've got this guy named Ziggy, who I think he's been implicated in sex crimes, and he was
against
also
children, against minors, right?
Yeah. And he impersonated he used the WikiLeaks merchandise store to, without authorization, sell goods, and then he took $50,000 and embezzled it from WikiLeaks and was actually charged with crimes in Iceland. Now, of course, because you're bringing in the era that involves Jeremy Hammond and the Stratfor hack, because you're bringing that in, get to involve Hector or Sabu. And he, of course, was an FBI informant that was involved in working to entrap WikiLeaks. We know that these servers were essentially, set up in such a way that they were trying to nail Julian Assange. There was attempts by people who were working with the FBI, like Sabu, to try to get WikiLeaks to pay for information. And of course, that never happened. And so now we've seen a dramatic expansion of this case beyond what I understand it to be, beyond what the legal team understands it to be. And this happened just a month and a half before we were supposed to have the trial part of this extradition hearing. It's entirely absurd that the judge would allow this. And yet, of course, because she is compromised, as Declassified UK has exposed, she set this up where it was, you should ask for an adjournment of the proceedings. Well, the defense team really didn't want to do that because Julian Assange is rotting away in a jail cell, and they'd like to get to a decision here so that they can proceed with the next phase, or if they win, maybe he would be allowed out of a jail cell. Who knows? So they don't want to postpone the proceedings. So instead, they decided to take the step of trying to ask her to remove all this new conduct from the indictment that had never been there when these proceedings start. And what they would probably say is a violation of the extradition treaty between the United States and the UK, because you're not giving proper notice to the accused. Well, she decided she's not going to use her authority. Now is not the right time. So then they came back after talking to Julian Assange and decided, we would like an adjournment to January because we need time to prepare a case. And basically she said, you're screwed. You should have asked for that back in August. And so that's how the first week kicked off. And we didn't even really have a witness until the last hour. And we had so many technical difficulties trying to bring that witness into the proceedings that we had to have him be brought back the following day. We didn't even hear that much testimony from him. And I mean, it's just, it's absolutely insane, some of what is going on here in this courtroom, because I just don't think, I mean, the times that we find ourselves in, I don't think that we're all equipped to actually follow and understand what is going on. I mean, I think we are. I think the three of us here are. And I think there are others more closely following this that understand. But I just think that there's just so much going on in the world, and there's just so many different pressures that are coming down all around this courthouse that it's almost impossible to expect anybody to pick up on all the threads that they need to within this case. And that's obviously to the U.S. government's benefit.
I do not think I'm capable of picking up on all the threads at this point. I mean, I'm focused on a specific thread within the investigation, but I mean, bringing you on and hearing you describe what's going on, a lot of this is news to me, and that speaks to the complexity of the case, and it's complex by design.
Yeah. Well, and of course, the way that I've been able to do this very well is because I already have the entire case against Chelsea Manning in my head from following that court-martial. And I basically thought that what they were doing is taking the Chelsea Manning case and trying to charge Julian Assange with it. I basically thought that they were saying that, he did what Chelsea Manning was accused of doing. And that to me was like a basic way to communicate to people that this was a dangerous case, because I don't support using the Espionage Act to go after whistleblowers. But one line that has not been crossed in our is to take that and go after the people who are publishing the material from any source.
Right.
And now it appears to me that we've actually gone into uncharted territory even further, because we're just trying to take anything we can to create catch-all crimes against Julian Assange,
who again is not a U.S. citizen, is not a UK citizen. I mean, that's even more Orwellian. It's already bad enough that they're trying to do this. Even if he were a U.S. or UK citizen, it would be Orwellian and authoritarian. But it's a whole new level, because now they're opening the door for being able to do this against any journalist anywhere in the world.
Yeah, so let me just make this point. I want to make sure I get this in before we wrap this show, which is that they are charging him under the Espionage Act, while at the same time they're claiming that as they use this U.S. law against him, he should not have First Amendment rights. It's completely absurd. And as James Goodall, I keep referencing him because I did an interview with him back in February before the 1 week legal hearing. And I asked him, I said, how can you charge someone under a U.S. law, but yet deny him the kind of protections that would come under the Constitution if you were charged under this law? And he said, absolutely. You can't have it both ways. Either they have the right to charge him under the Espionage Act, and then he has First Amendment rights, and he should be able to use it to invoke it against being prosecuted under the Espionage Act, or they have absolutely no grounds to bring this prosecution against him because he is not a U.S. citizen. And because he's not a U.S. citizen, he does not have to abide by U.S. secrecy laws or regulations. I mean, nobody around the world outside of the U.S., and also, I mean, I would include myself in this, and inside the U.S., we don't sign non-disclosure agreements. I am under no obligation whatsoever to hold secrets in such high esteem and regard, even though daily with people like Rachel Maddow and my theory is you talk about like cases that they won't follow because they completely you want to talk about a case that they wouldn't follow The Reality Winner case just seems one that was so tailored for them to follow from the very beginning because it played into the Russiagate narrative. And I think Rachel Maddow and others just won't touch it because they believe that U.S. secrets are just so sacrosanct and not to be violated. And I see that too here with Julian Assange. And so like globally around the world here, the big thing is the idea that the U.S. would assert jurisdiction over journalists in any part of the world. And if you obtain classified information from the U.S. government, the message is clear, much like we have seen the transformation since the September 11th attacks into this idea that the world is a battlefield and we can drone bomb anywhere and we can deploy troops anywhere. And well, obviously we've had bases all over the world for quite a lot of time, but now we're going to assert control and dominance over any journalists. And we might round you up and try to bring you to the United States for publishing our classified information.
It really is. We're watching the concept of free speech and press freedom being reshaped and distorted before our eyes against a backdrop of a information war that is one component of the hybrid war that the U.S. is waging against what it calls its near peer competitors, Russia and China. And I think we've seen throughout the past week, for several weeks, an escalating attack on alternative media and on counter-hegemonic media from states that are designated enemies. And, I think this is all, we have to see it all as one part. We have to see the attack on Assange and WikiLeaks as part of the U.S. government's effort to limit the public's access to inconvenient facts. It's what I would call free speech with American characteristics, where information is limited, the information flow is limited by the U.S. government, but the U.S. public is unable to see the censor's hand. It's I would say, a more crude repackaging or iteration of the Ed Herman model of propaganda, of manufacturing consent. It's actually enforcing consent. And Julian Assange, why is he in the glass box? Why has he been in solitary confinement during COVID, during a pandemic? Why is he in a maximum security prison instead of being under house arrest? Why was he confined for years in an embassy for jumping bail? Why has he been so roundly demonized by the stenographers of power? It is to make an example of him in medieval fashion, as Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, as so many figures who led rebellions were publicly tortured. This is what's going on here. And the point of it all is to just say, you could be next. And I think for many opportunists and careerists, they've shut up. They understand the message. They're taking it. And the question is, who's going to take that risk? Who's going to run up against this constantly shifting government red line on speech and take that risk to do real national security reporting, which could include publishing classified information or publishing information about covert U.S. activity to tell the public? Because as Julian Assange said, every war is the product of lies. And the best mechanism to stop wars is to simply tell the public the truth. That's what this is about. That's why I'm interested in it. That's why I'm so passionate about it. I know that's how you feel, Kevin and Ben. But if you want to offer any thoughts on why you were focused on this well before I was. I was not focused on I was advocating for Chelsea Manning's freedom, but I wasn't as focused on it as you were. So why were you, as a journalist, why were you so focused on this from the beginning?
I would say some of it is because of my own personal benefit, and the fact that if I benefited from it, then I have to show human decency and continue to follow it until its logical conclusion. Or, it's not logical, but until it actually has unfolded to where there's nothing to report on anymore. And I don't know when that will be. It could be 5 or 10 years before we're all done. I certainly thought Chelsea Manning was going to be it, but I'd say that I owe my current existence as a journalist to what WikiLeaks published. I mean, I cut my teeth writing about the diplomatic cables that were published by WikiLeaks. I was churning out daily stories about those contents back in 2011. I happened to get an internship at The Nation where I was following all of this closely from inside the newsroom there in New York, following all the documents that were coming out and the efforts to demonize Julian Assange. And so that's how I got my start. I mean, people know me for my work with the coverage of Chelsea Manning, and I covered everything until she had her sentence commuted and was mercifully let out of prison there. But then, we've now entered this new chapter here with Julian Assange. And of course, she also was someone who, we shouldn't forget, was unfairly targeted and made to go to jail for over a year because she wouldn't comply with the grand jury that was set up to destroy WikiLeaks. And one note that I know will be of interest to you to work in as we're concluding here is that I know you're familiar with the assistant U.S. attorney who was on this case, Gordon Kromberg,
Right.
who was involved with the political prosecution against Samuel Arian, and also has a record of basically using grand juries to set up people for perjury traps. And I know that that's something that was warned, that her attorney, Chelsea Manning, was warned to avoid, because what they were trying to do is bring Chelsea Manning in to contradict testimony that she had given to a military court-martial. And if she had done that, if they had been able to break her, they would have turned her into a star prosecution witness against Julian Assange. It would have been an amazing victory for the US government to turn a source against this journalist that has been so roundly demonized, and they failed because she stood up to them. And I think, we talk a lot about Julian Assange, but I think one thing about whatever happens in the end, I know for a fact that the US government is tremendously frustrated that they were not able to get Chelsea Manning to testify. I'm not sure what they were trying to get from Jeremy Hammond. They did subpoena him and haul him to a grand jury. He had his sentence disrupted. It was almost over. He was almost done serving his 10-year sentence. He was in the RDAP program and was supposed to be let out for being involved in the substance abuse program. And now it restarted the clock, and he had to go back to prison and continue to serve more time. And during a global pandemic, too, where we know it's been completely uncontrolled and they haven't taken care of people at all during this time in prison. And so it's just something I think people need to remember, that I think that she took a great stand, and Julian Assange and the entire WikiLeaks team are indebted to what she did, because she certainly didn't have to. She didn't have to stand up for the U.S. For all that she's gone through, I wouldn't have thought anything less of her if she completely folded, since she's been so tortured and psychologically beaten down. But she held her ground, and it completely decimated one tactic the U.S. government was trying to roll out in order to beat Julian.
Yeah, definitely. It was a terrible choice Chelsea Manning was put in, because she was presented by Gordon Kromberg, who was a ardently pro-Israel lawyer who presided over a lot of the phony post 9/11 terror prosecutions, especially Samuel Arian's. He was notorious for the perjury trap. Chelsea Manning was presented with the perjury trap, where they try to get you on the stand after you've already been acquitted or let off to testify against someone else, and you run the risk of becoming the star witness in another case or putting yourself back in legal jeopardy. And Kromberg actually did this to another terror suspect who really was not guilty of anything. I'm forgetting his name. I think he was from Sudan, Samuel Bakri. I can't remember his name, but he had already been let off by a jury, and he agreed to testify again in another case and was accused of perjuring himself and went back to jail. And that is what Kromberg tried to do to Samuel Arian, who, had a hung jury. Basically, they had nothing on him except that he said like inflammatory things in public. And they tried to get him to testify against another American Muslim nonprofit, Triple IT. And he refused to do it because he understood what Kromberg's tactics were. And so they threw him in a federal prison and then held him under house arrest with an ankle bracelet for years until they completely dropped the case after Judge Brinkema, who will rule on Julian Assange's case, finally decided to rule. She just waited years. It's a terrible situation to be put in. And this is the court. What is it? The 4th District Court, or sorry.
It's the Eastern District of
Eastern
Virginia.
District Court. Yeah. It's a court that convicts like 99% of national security cases before it, right?
Well, yeah, and that's the big thing that his legal team trying to show the judge, is that there's no way that Julian Assange could ever get a fair trial in this district. I mean, you're talking about a jury of spooks, potentially, if you are put on trial in this district. These are people who are going to, no matter what, if they don't work for the government, they have family who work for the government. And they're going to feel like Julian Assange attacked them personally if they have to review this case.
Yep. I mean, you had the embassy protectors from the Venezuelan embassy, including our good friend Kevin Zees, who we just lost this week. The Embassy 4 were put on trial in in Washington, D.C., and their jury pool, because it was Washington, D.C., consisted of African Americans who comprise the majority of the D.C. population, and a bunch of spooks or people connected to spooks. I mean, that's what you get in D.C. In Northern Virginia, it's even more extreme, and the jury selection is going to be slanted against the defense.
Yeah, and I've learned that you can actually, because of the nature of this case, the U.S. government could put Julian Assange on trial in any district that they choose, because he's not from the United States.
Right.
And so you can actually fly the defendant who is not from the U.S. to any jurisdiction and then arraign them in that court, and then that's where the trial will take place.
It's important to illustrate what kind of show trial would await Assange in the United States. Do you think, just in closing, and like Ben, if you have anything to add, I don't want to cut in, but I had one last question, which is, do you think under a Biden administration, the prosecution would be withdrawn, or the demand for an extradition could be withdrawn because it was Obama at the end, through negotiations with Chelsea Manning's legal team, that ended that prosecution?
So first, I'll say that the Chelsea Manning commutation is something that the defense has been suggesting Donald Trump's administration might be offended by, and that might be partly to some small degree, a very small degree, but some part of why they are Julian Assange prosecution, because they wanted to remind us that they believe these were crimes that were committed, and that they actually don't agree that Chelsea Manning should still be in Leavenworth prison, enduring psychological harm and probably trying to commit suicide every other month because it was horrible what she was going through. I think that if Joe Biden is elected, we shouldn't count on him abandoning this case, simply because one of the ways that the Justice Department, when Attorney General Eric Holder was in charge, one of the ways they justified their war on whistleblowers was to say that they inherited leak prosecutions from George W. Bush, the predecessor, and that they really didn't start some of these. So you had individuals like NSA whistleblower Thomas Drake, who was targeted and accused of retaining classified information, and had his life destroyed, and ended up working in an Apple store for the rest of his life because he ended up being a source for a Baltimore Sun reporter. And that's just one example. John Kiriaku's case, he's accused of what he did when he came forward, when he first became targeted as a CIA officer, when he went and did the interview for ABC News confirming that the Bush administration was engaged in waterboarding. That was 2007. That's before Barack Obama was elected. And so they inherit these cases and they pursued them. And I think that if Joe Biden were to somehow manage to not botch this and actually get to the White House, then he would be probably doing the same thing, where he just says that I'm continuing what was started before me by the previous Justice Department regime, and that I have no choice. My hands are tied, especially if the judge managed to authorize extradition of Julian before he was inaugurated in January. I don't know if he would challenge the appeals. I could actually see a scenario where he says, my hands are tied. I'm going to let the process play out. Let's see what happens, as if the UK process is completely divorced from anything related to what could happen in the US. I mean, I could see him letting the appeals go on and on and on for the next 3 to 4 years. And then if the US government won, well, you might have that the administration of Joe Biden is completely over. Or, if it was even up to him, maybe you'd say at that point, oh, okay, he's now going to face trial and people don't want a US trial against Julian Assange. Well, let's let him go. But then you've allowed 4 or 5 years of this man's life to be completely stolen from him. And we already see what condition he is in. And we know that he may not even live for 4 or 5 more years in these conditions.
Indeed. Ben, the floor is yours.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's unfortunately that's a good note to end on. I mean, we've seen the torture of Julian Assange, and I want to stress this point again. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, the leading UN expert on torture, Nils Melzer, has said repeatedly, has written about how Julian Assange is being tortured. And by the way, Nils Melzer has tried to publish several articles and op-eds about that and has been rejected by many mainstream newspapers, large media outlets. So this case could hardly be more important. I think it's important for everyone in the world, but it's especially important for any journalist. And the fact that very few journalists, not even just in the US, but in other countries, are covering this is shameful. And, we were talking about the threats to the First Amendment. It's also, I just want to underscore what Max said. It's at a time when the First Amendment is under attack for everyone in the United States. And we saw Tom Cotton, one of the most just criminal cretins in U.S. politics, a hardcore neoconservative. This is a guy who just has a permanent hard-on for war. He just loves destroying every country that refuses to bow down to the U.S. And he's being considered a future leader of the Republican Party and potentially a president after a Republican president that would come down the line.
Also, Trump pitched him as a potential Supreme Court pick this week.
Yeah, and so this guy this extreme war criminal, I mean, one of the most just hardened war criminals you can imagine, who he even makes other, neoconservatives like John Bolton look mild compared to him. He tweeted this week, Tom Cotton, that the First Amendment only applies to freedom of religion. So even aside from the fact that his political career, the fact that he might potentially be a Republican presidential candidate, the fact that he's being considered for the Supreme Court and he's on record already saying that he doesn't believe in the First Amendment, that he doesn't believe in the other 3 prominent elements, the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly. I mean, of course, he's saying that in the context of the protests going on and saying that Americans don't have the right to protest. They only have the right to religion. But I mean, this is the future not only of the Republican Party, but I think of U.S. politics in general. And as you just acknowledged, Joe Biden certainly doesn't inspire confidence. The people around him, top cop Kamala Harris. It's a very, very depressing moment. But on that note, I think we'll just go out. We were speaking with Kevin Gosztola. You can find him on Twitter, and you can see, for anyone watching on YouTube, I have his Twitter handle up. It's K Gosztola. And for people listening, you can find his work at shadowproof.com. Very good website.
Yeah, support Kevin's work at Shadowproof. I mean, Kevin's doing real shoe leather journalism on this trial, and he relies, and just like us at Moderate Rebels, he relies entirely on your support. So go to Shadowproof and support Kevin.
Absolutely. And you can also check out his podcast with our colleague, Ronnie Akalik. It's called Unauthorized Disclosure. And for people who want to support us, please go to patreon.com/Moderate Rebels. And Kevin, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for your hard work, Kevin.
Cool. And on that note, we'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening.